G'day, if you've ever wanted to learn how to read a soil test, this video is for you. We have these custom-made soil tests that you can get from our website for free. You just need your soil test data, put in, and you get it for free to get efficiency levels as well as a nutritional recommendation for your soil test. So to do that, head over to our website at agresol.com.au, scroll down to free tools for farmers. You can see here we have our soil test, we have our Haney soil test, and we also have a free SAP test analysis. You can also find it by going onto our free tools tab. Now, if you want a soil test done, we can do it for you through our consulting service. Now, if you're anyone like me that's super interested in agriculture and you love doing your own research, it actually can be really hard to find how to read soil tests. So hopefully today in this video, I cover all of that and also how to calculate your own nutritional requirements. Now, what I've done in our soil test is I've taken a lot of the guidelines from this book, so Interpreting Soil Test Results, as well as a few other references from Aubrek, and put them into this soil test to develop guidelines that you can actually use on your own farm. So before we go on, we're going to go to the whiteboard and see some different principles as well as how to calculate your own nutritional recommendations. Okay, so I thought it would be really helpful if I draw a bit of a diagram and explain what exactly is going on. So firstly, we have our cations. So cations are positively charged ions. They stick to clay particles or negatively charged sites. And so you have three things going on here. You have the minerals within the soil particles or within the minerals, I guess. This is dependent on your soil parent material. So this is what our total fragments come from, or our total minerals. They're stuck inside here. They can't get out. They're not available to the plant. Over time, our minerals weather and then become available. They release them and they stick to the clay particles. These ones here on the outside is what is expressed in our cation exchange capacity. So you'll see here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sites. Hydrogen takes up one of those sites. So the base saturation, which is the base cations, takes up 6 out of the 7 sites, and hydrogen takes up 1 out of the 7 sites. So that's going to have a base saturation of 6 out of 7, whatever that is as a percentage. So that's what the base saturation is. In terms of the percentage of the actual cations in the cells, it's going to be what percentage of the sites that they take up. So the calcium is going to take up 2 out of 7. Well, obviously this is not the ideal balance, but 2 out of 7, 2 out of 7, 1 out of 7, 1 out of 7. That's more or less how it works. Now, on our soil test, we have the total exchangeable as well as the solution of the minerals. So total exchangeable, so what's actually on the outside, and solution, so what's actually in the soil water or the soil solution. So what happens is the plant can take either from the solution, so this is super easy to take because there's not much energy to take it from the water into the root, or the exchangeable. It can take either. If it wants to take from the exchangeable, it has to release a hydrogen to release it. So the plant gives a hydrogen ion and takes, say, the potassium there. So this is what happens over time, which is why we see soils that have been farmed quite heavily with no nutrition added back, is that you then get a buildup of hydrogen on the clay colloid, which increases acidity. So then we get our hydrogen goes there, our plant takes that potassium, which is great for that. But over time, if the weathering process doesn't keep up and releases that potassium to here, we're going to get a buildup of hydrogen. Now that hydrogen over time releases into our soil solution, which causes acidity, or the pH. So the buildup of the hydrogen in the soil solution will increase the pH, and that's pretty much it. These exchange within whatever. Now, if we want to change the percentage of cations on the clay colloids, what we have to do is add more of that particular mineral to knock out whatever we want. And I'll explain this a bit further in depth in a soil balancing video. But basically, if we want to reduce the amount of magnesium we have in our soil to improve the Cal-Mag ratio or whatever, we're going to apply gypsum or lime, depending on our soil. And basically, when we have all of this calcium here, that's going to overpower the magnesium and it's going to swap it out so we have more calcium on the colloid. Now, as I was saying, when it comes to total available and soluble, we have our total phosphorus. So if that's sitting at that 70, I think it was 78 parts per million, and then it comes down to 19, and then it comes down to the 3 point something, 3.5. You can see how it steps down slowly. This is most available. This is more available, but still the plant has to work by putting out different root exudates to solubilize the phosphorus. Might increase the acidity to break up some of the ways that this phosphorus binds to, say, calcium or iron or whatever. But it's really this total phosphorus, that stored up amount, that's pretty important. Some people that have been applying super for a long time have a very large amount of this, as the phosphorus binds with other minerals. So that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at the difference between these and these. The available is what we're going to judge more or less this year's nutrition plan on. Now, this took me a little while to learn because simply for some reason, no one wants to talk about it. So this is how you work out your application rates. You take your ideal level. So this is for our potassium in our soil test. The ideal level is 100 parts million. Parts million is the same as milligrams per kilogram. Now that's a concentration. That doesn't actually help when we're talking about a hectare. So ideally we want to figure out how many kilos of this nutrient are we going to apply per hectare. So we currently have 50 milligrams per kilogram. We want 100 milligrams per kilogram. So we work out the difference, which is ideal minus our current, and we need to apply enough so that the concentration is now 50 milligrams per kilogram. I'm just going to say parts per million from now on. But remember, we want it in kilograms per hectare. So what do we need to do? We first need to figure out how many kilograms of soil there is so that we can work out what we need to apply. So how many kilograms of soil is in a hectare? It depends on what depth we want to apply it to. So in most applications, we want to be applying it to 10 centimeters, or we want to work on 10 centimeters. We could also work on 15 centimeters. It really depends, but 10 centimeters is the go. So in terms of how much soil, or the weight of the soil in 1 hectare to 10 centimeters deep, it's 10,000 square meters, which is, because we're working metric, which is far superior to the imperial system, we have 10,000 meters squared in a hectare, which is 100 meters by 100 meters, rather than all this feet and A's and whatever. So we've got 10,000 square meters in a hectare. We're going to times that by 0.1 meters, which is the depth we want to go to, 10 centimeters deep. And that will give us the volume of a hectare down to 10 centimeters. Now we want to times that by the bulk density, which is well, it depends on your soil. It's going to roughly be around that 1.4 mark. In sandier soils, it might be higher or lower. Clay might be higher or lower. You can check it out online, what your bulk density should be. Typically, you can assume we're at that 1.4, which is, I think it's tons per meters cubed. So that works out to be 1,400 tons of soil per hectare down to 10 centimeters. Now we want to convert that into kilos, which is super easy because we work in such a good system. Just add 3 zeros on. Kilos per hectare. So now we have kilos per hectare. We currently have a concentration. So for every one of these kilos, we're going to get this many milligrams. So we times this number by that number, and we get 70 times 10 to the power of 6 milligrams per hectare of that nutrient to be applied. And then what we need to do is convert this from milligrams to grams to kilos, which basically just each step up you take off 3 zeros. So that works out to be 70 kilos per hectare. And that's the application rate of straight potassium. So we write potassium there at the end. So our report gives that to you for free. It uses 1.4 tons per hectare, or 1.4 tons per hectare as the bulk density. You can change it depending on what you want. But this is how you work out your application rate of straight potassium or whatever nutrient. Finally, what you got to do is convert this into your product. So say your product is 20% potassium. What you want to do now is times this by 5 or divide it by 20% to work out the application rate of a product so that you achieve your 70 kilos per hectare. Anyway, so the report does this automatically. But if you have a soil test you want to do by yourself, you can do it now. Now, before we get further into it, there's really 3 things we're looking for when looking at a soil test. The first one is any soil limitations. So these are things that are going to prevent our plants from growing. That can be a high or low pH. It can be too saline conditions or soil salinity or soil acidity. They're typically the main ones. Compaction wouldn't really be covered here. You can look at the Cal-Mag ratio, but it wouldn't be really considered. The next one is deficiencies. We want to know whether or not we're going to have more or less, according to the law of minimums, a deficiency was going to prevent the plant from growing. And then the final thing we want to look at is excesses. Things that are in excess which are going to antagonize the uptake of other minerals. This is more or less important here, more important in SAP tests, quite important. But this, a soil test will kind of tell us what the plant has available to it in total, and then we focus on the SAP test later. But anyways, getting into it. So when we look at a soil test, firstly we want to look at more or less the metadata. So up here, we want to look at when the sample is taken, make sure the year's right, as well as more or less the month and the date. When the report was made, sample ID, client's name, and paddock name. All these things, super important to make sure we know what soil was taken where, what time, and whatnot. There's no point in having all these soil tests if you don't know where they were taken, because then we don't know where to make a recommendation. So on our soil test, we have our soil texture. It's just handy to know, as well as the color, which is also handy to know sometimes. And then we actually get into it. So there's a few things when looking at a soil test we need to understand. The first one is the actual parameter of what we're looking at, which is this row. We have more or less sometimes methodology, but also the units of which they're taken. So you can see here we have percentages. We also have milligrams per kilogram, which is also parts per million, so the same thing. We have what's found in your soil test, in your actual soil. So this is what we found, and then that's the desired level here. So this is what we want to be aiming for. Sometimes it's needs to be greater than this number. Also, other times it needs to be around this number, so a 10% deviation from the number, which is typically what we have here, apart from a few things. Sometimes we want to be under certain numbers, depending on if it's going to limit our soil test. And then finally, we have our soil status, which is low, ideal, and high levels. We put this in here because we find it really useful to analyze what is our limiting factor. So when you look at a soil test like this, and you see things that are the lowest, oftentimes they're the things you need to fix straight away, and you'll get the biggest responses in your crops. Cool, so the very first thing we have on our soil test is pH. pH is a really good one, a really good chemical property of our soil that tells you so much of it. It'll tell you whether or not the plant can actually grow in it. When it's too acidic or too basic, the plant simply can't grow. It prevents enzyme activity. And the next one is nutrient availability. So they're 2 big ones. You don't want it too high, you don't want it too low. So you want it around that 6.3 mark for a sandy soil. When a soil becomes more clay, it'll move up into the 6.5, but in between 6.3 and 6.5 is pretty good. So next we have electrical conductivity. This is the saltiness of the water, more or less. This is quite important. You don't want it too high. On the lower side, it's not bad. You just don't want it too high. Now, the important thing to know is that there's guidelines for the different soil textures as to whether or not, or what's the limit or not. Our soil test, the guidelines change depending on your CC, which is a function of texture. So that's all important to note. These will change depending on if you have a high CC soil or a low CC soil. So these are the guidelines for a sandy soil, and they'll change if you don't have a sandy soil. Next, we're looking at our organic matter or component of our soil test. Now, organic matter, ideally we want in a sandy soil more than 2.5, or over here, which is a function of our total carbon, which is ideally 1.4. Over here, it's around that 2% mark, which is pretty good, not bad for a sandy soil. Ideally, the higher we can push that, the better. But here, it's not that bad. Oftentimes, when thinking about soil organic matter, we can forget about nitrogen, but nitrogen is just as important. So here we have our total nitrogen, which is actually made up of inorganic nitrogen, so ammonium and nitrate, but also our organic nitrogen, which we'll talk about in a moment. Ideally, we want a carbon to nitrogen ratio of around 11%. If it's higher than that, so more carbon, it means that nitrogen will be locked up when we apply it, so we get what's called nitrogen immobilization. So that can lock up nitrogen. On the other hand, if we have more nitrogen than carbon, then nitrogen will become available, it will mineralize and become available to the plant. So the soil will try and get it to around 11. If it's above or below that, nitrogen availability will change. So you can see here, it's around that 17, which means if we apply nitrogen, or say a cover crop that's high in nitrogen, a lot of that nitrogen will be stored in soil organic matter. It will be locked up. The next component we have our cation exchange. This is the ability of our cations to exchange, starting with effective cation exchange capacity. Another name for this is total cation exchange capacity. This tells us the overall size of our soil to hold onto cations. It's the negative charge sites on clay particles as well as humus or soil organic matter. Now you can see here there's not much of a range and there's no ideal levels, and that's because you can't really change the CEC of your soil. You can, to some extent, increase it with soil organic matter, but it's really dependent on the amount of clay you have in your soil, which is dependent on your parent material and the age of your soil. So the only way you can really change the CEC is to buy a different farm. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck with it. But it's good to know, just to know the productive capacity of your soil. Next, this is something that we can actually change, and it's called base saturation. Now, base saturation is the sum of our base cations, which are calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. All these things add up to our base saturation, and it's as a percent. So it's the percentage of our clay colloids which are containing these base cations. So ideally, we want it around, for a sandy soil, 85%, but this one is 77%, so it's not bad. It means that there's a lot of room if we apply more base cations for those cations to occupy a colloid. So moving through these pretty quickly, calcium is pretty fine. It's found at 59%. Ideally, we want it 60, so pretty much spot on. Magnesium might be a little bit low, potassium a little bit low. Sodium is okay. Now, really, we don't want it past this 3%. If it goes past that 3%, and especially into 6%, that's when it starts to become sodic. And you don't want sodicity because it antagonizes the uptake of the other cations. So there's a whole range of different problems that causes. We have a whole video on managing sodic soils. You can go check that out. Next, aluminium. Aluminium is important in small amounts, not too much. It can cause toxicity. So likewise, you don't want it more than 3%. Finally, hydrogen. Hydrogen is more or less that empty space on the colloid. Ideally, we want it around that 6%, just enough to leave it available for the clay particles to weather and release different minerals. Here, it's pretty high. It's at 21%, which means there's a lot of capacity and area for us to be able to apply nutrition or minerals, cations specifically, to take up those colloids. So that's a good thing to note. If it's 0, then there's not much area on the colloids for additional minerals to take place, which means we'll be kicking off minerals more or less losing money. Finally, we have our Cal-Mag ratio. Now, this comes into the philosophy and concept of soil balancing and Aubrich's soil balancing techniques, where they suggest that the cations have a particular ratio in order for them to be ideal. Now, there's a lot of debate in the scientific community whether or not this is valid or not. What we do at Agresol is we consider it. It's not everything. We consider both sides. On the extreme side that works, we also consider it with biology, which I think is a missing component. So it's important, but not super important. So when we look at a 4.2, I wouldn't say that's too bad. It's a bit high past the 3, but it's not crazy. So this is something I really wouldn't be managing too much towards, especially for a soil that has a fair good amount of soil organic carbon. I think that would be fine. The other thing is you want to get onto the farm and actually have a look for yourself. If it's not a limiting factor, then there's no point in fixing it. Next, we have our nitrogen and sulfur. Now, I'll put these together for a reason I'll explain later. But first, we look at our inorganic sources of nitrogen, so nitrate and ammonium. So you can see here, nitrate, 9.3 versus 10. Now, you want a little bit of nitrate just to give that plant a kickstart with available nitrogen. You don't want too much. When you get too much, that's a problem. You just want enough. Likewise with ammonium, we're slightly deficient in ammonium, so potentially a little bit of an application of ammonium we're starting would be a good idea. Finally, we have our estimated organic nitrogen, which is a function of our total nitrogen. It's around 2 to 3% of the total organic nitrogen gets converted into available organic nitrogen a year. Now, ideally, we want actually a fair amount of the total nitrogen in our soil. Here, it's a little bit deficient, sitting around that 23. So, slightly deficient. I think this is something we can definitely and should try and definitely build up because nitrogen is so important for our crop production. Next is sulfur. Sulfur is very important for the production of two essential amino acids, methionine and cysteine. They're both required, or methionine is very important because it's the first amino acid in every single protein. Without it, you can't develop proteins. So when you have a sulfur deficiency, you can't develop complete proteins, which is very important. You can see here we're slightly deficient from an overall perspective. So if our ideal level is here, we're sitting pretty far away from it at a 7. So ideally, maybe a bit of a gypsum application would be good on this. On the other hand, we have our total. Now this is the first time in this soil test we're talking about totals. And the total is the total amount of that nutrient in the soil, more or less. It's technically a little bit less because it's a pseudo total, but it's good enough. What this tells us is what's in the bank account, that the available component of the soil can draw upon. If there's nothing in there, then there's nothing for it to draw upon. But here in the sulfur, you can actually say it's a good amount of sulfur that will recharge this available component in time. Now, I think in this particular soil, we have a low amount of sulfur here is because in a sandy soil, you have a lot of leaching. And so there's a potential for the sulfur here to be leached away if the rainfall is high enough. So you get a recharge event from your total sulfur, but it's actually being leached away from your available component. So that could be a case going on here. Finally, we have our inorganic nitrogen to sulfur. Now, the reason why we have this ratio is because we want to know if sulfur is a limiting factor in the conversion of nitrates or inorganic nitrogen into amino acids and proteins by microbes. You can see here, ideally, we want a 10-to-1 ratio. We've got a bit below that, meaning that sulfur is in abundance or more of an abundance. So sulfur here won't be affecting the conversion process into proteins, so that's good. If this is in past 10, it means we really should be applying sulfur, otherwise we might be losing nitrogen to other sources. Next we have our phosphorus. Phosphorus is super important. So there's 5 different categories we measure this on. The first one is soluble phosphorus. This is easy to acquire phosphorus for our plants. We want a little bit, we don't want too much. When there's too much, then it prevents our mycorrhizal fungi colonization, so we don't want that. We just want enough for the plant to get kick-started with root development. So you can see here it's a little bit deficient. It's in a 3.3 versus a 5, so a little bit would be good, but not crazy. Now phosphorus is a really interesting one because it locks up and becomes fixed very easily. And so different extraction techniques aim to give us a better understanding of the availability of phosphorus at different times. So we have our Bray 1, which is the most gentle extraction technique. We have our Cowell and our Bray 2, getting more and more harsh and explaining the availability of different minerals in terms of harshness or difficulty to extract. So Bray 1 should be the easiest, and you can see here it's 6.3, so it's more or less very light stuff. Cowell sitting at a 9, and interestingly, the Bray 2 is sitting under the Cowell. Not sure why. But overall, everything's deficient. Everything's below the critical value, including our total phosphorus. Now, total phosphorus is super important to get analysed. I would highly recommend it. And it tells us the bank account of phosphorus in our soil. So if you've had a history of applying a lot of super and a lot of phosphorus to our soil, sometimes you can actually get a massive buildup of phosphorus. You don't need to apply anymore, you just need to unlock it. And so I've seen soils that had more than 1,000 parts per million of phosphorus, which is a lot of phosphorus. It can start causing a lot of problems because it antagonizes other things like zinc. This soil, on the other hand, simply doesn't have much phosphorus. And so adding phosphorus to this soil would be very important in order to optimize production. And this kind of leads us to a conversation about adding nutrition. So there's some streams of thought in the regenerative community where you don't need to add nutrition because the soil microbes will make it available to the plant. And that is true given you have enough in your totals. So you can see here, there's simply no phosphorus. There's no phosphorus in the soil to then be able to convert it into our available fractions, which means we simply need to add phosphorus to the soil in order to achieve available phosphorus. Now there's some minerals on the other hand that you don't need to do this because there's heaps of that mineral in the soil and the plant can unlock it. In this case, we do have to apply it. Now it's also important to note that this is only looking at the top 10 centimeters of soil. A plant can go right down to a meter, even past a meter. So if you want to get a really good understanding of the nutrients you have available to the plant, you can take multiple soil tests going down to a meter. The quality of your soil data, now it's important to know that's going to get quite costly, especially if you're taking more and more soil samples per site and getting your totals done on them. Getting something in the subsoil is quite helpful. You first need to identify where the subsoil is, but it can be a helpful test to guide you on your nutritional applications. But in terms of applying nutrition, you only can really affect the top 10 centimeters of soil. You can't quite apply nutrition unless you're deep ripping and injecting it down there into your subsoil. So you're only really working in your topsoil until you get roots into your subsoil to improve it. But you can't quite nutritionally fix your subsoil unless you apply things that leach down. Finally, coal. Coal is an interesting extraction technique, and it's best paired with the phosphorus buffering index, which is an index which describes the ability for your soil to lock up phosphorus. Now that's quite important, and really you should have that number so you can compare your coal P number to your phosphorus buffering index, because it will change your thresholds. So here we have a rough threshold that changes with different cation exchange capacities and your texture. It's good enough, but ideally, if you have soils that are high in available or reactive iron, manganese, calcium, and aluminium, I think, then it's really worthwhile getting the phosphorus buffering index added onto your test, which we can do. So moving on to our cations. So we previously looked at our cations in terms of their percentage on the colloid, but now we're looking at them in terms of their concentration, which is just as important, I think. Similar to our phosphorus, we have 3 different extraction techniques or ways of looking at our nutrients. We have our soluble, we also have exchangeable and total. So again, soluble, most easy, exchangeable or available is probably what's available to the plant in a given growing season, and then total is that bank account that we can draw upon. So you can see here, the calcium is fine in terms of exchangeable and soluble. What might be a problem here is the total calcium, which is looking to be a little bit low. I wouldn't worry too much about it unless these soluble and exchangeable levels drop in the future. So this is where looking at your soil tests over time and comparing what direction are these things going in, which is super important. Similar thing with magnesium. Magnesium is very important. It's pretty fine in the soluble and exchangeable, but getting a bit low in our totals here. So it's also something considering applying. When we look at magnesium up here, it might be a little bit deficient, so it's worthwhile considering making an application. And finally, potassium. Potassium is super important, especially during grain fill. The interesting thing here is that when we enter the data, what we like to do, if the test says less than a certain number, it means that the measurement of the instrument that they used to measure that nutrient wasn't good enough to actually determine what number that mineral or the concentration of that mineral was. And so they put the highest number that they can record. And so here is 25 for our soluble and 50 for our exchangeable. So the test should really say less than 25 and less than 50. We put in those numbers because we don't want to make an application which or over apply a mineral, because over applying potassium can be just as worse as under applying it, or the deficiency in itself. It can prevent the uptake of calcium, which is important for all other critical stages of influence on our crop yield. But here we're critically deficient, so it's very worthwhile consider making a potassium application and then potentially even follow applying throughout the season. Now, finally, for our sodium and aluminium, we're looking more at limitations, or what's going to be limiting soil fertility. We don't want too much sodium. It's a little bit high. It's 3 times our threshold, or almost 3 times our threshold. But the total sodium is not that bad. So it's something maybe to consider if it's coming up in the SAP test because it's antagonizing calcium, magnesium, and potassium, then we should consider it. But really nothing too much to report here. Likewise with aluminium. Now, finally, we get onto some really interesting stuff in our trace minerals. Trace minerals are definitely something to pay attention to. They're super important. Similar to our other minerals, we have our total and we also have what's available. Total is important because that's what we draw upon. So you can see here in zinc, manganese, copper, and silicon, we don't have that much in the totals. We don't have much in the reserves for our availables to then draw upon, which means we do need to apply it. Now, there's a whole range of different ways we can apply it, and that's where I guess we can help with our consulting. We know the best form to apply it that's best for our biology and your pocket. So it's not going to cost too much, but it is something we do need to fix. So as you can see here, zinc's deficient, manganese deficient, iron is pretty good in the available, but slightly deficient in the totals. I wouldn't worry too much about this. Iron tends to be something that is fine given you have good soil health. Copper deficient as well. Boron's interesting because we have that high amount of total boron, which will then release into the available component. And this is similar to what I was saying with the sulfur. Boron is an anion, so it will leach through the soil surface because there's nothing for it to cling onto. It can on the what's called anion exchange capacity of our soil organic matter, but there's not that much. And so there's a potential for this boron to actually be leaching out of the soil surface. Next, we have silica. Silicon is really important. It's required in the strengthening of the cell wall, as well as reducing abiotic and biotic stress in our plant. Quite important. Adding potentially soft rock phosphate can alleviate or increase some of the silica, as well as that phosphorus that we were talking about before. That'd be a really good application for the soil. But overall, we want to be able to increase the totals as well as available for our silicon. Next, we have our chloride. Chloride is just an estimate. We don't want too high. We want a little bit, but not too much. If it's exceeding, maybe like this one, then we can start looking into our electrical conductivity and seeing whether or not that's a problem. And finally, we have the totals for molybdenum, cobalt, and selenium. They're all very important, and we tend to be deficient in them in a lot of our soils, especially molybdenum and cobalt, and as well as selenium. But molybdenum and cobalt here are quite interesting because they have a very important role to play in nitrogen fixation in legumes. And so molybdenum is required in the nitrogenase enzyme, which converts nitrogen gas into ammonia, which then can be used in legumes. And cobalt is important as it is, and cobalt's required in the production of leg hemoglobin. So it's not used in leg hemoglobin, but it's used as, I think it's a catalyst, or it's just required in that development of leg hemoglobin, which is the protein which maintains the nodules in an oxygen-free environment, which allows the rhizobium bacteria to then fix the nitrogen. So you can see here, that's deficient, molybdenum is deficient. So I would be suggesting that that's going to be reducing biological nitrogen fixation, which is quite important, especially if you're growing a legume or if you're relying on free living microbes to produce that nitrogen for you. And so when we go back up to the top, let me just clear this, and we look at our organic nitrogen or estimated organic nitrogen, you can see that's low. I would suggest that this lack of organic nitrogen and the lack of total nitrogen could be because of a lack in biological nitrogen fixation because of a lack of molybdenum and a lack of cobalt in our soil. Definitely something to consider if you're growing legumes or if you're applying some microbes to fix nitrogen. You need the minerals behind the microbes for them to actually work. The other thing is that we need to apply these minerals, and you don't need to apply much of them. So molybdenum here, it's currently sitting at a 0.2 milligrams per kilogram and 0.5 milligrams per kilogram. So that might only be half a kilo of molybdenum across a whole paddock. So it's not much, but it's essential. And it's best to apply that as, say, even a foliar onto, or a liquid application onto the soil surface to get a uniform distribution. And so looking at this soil test, there's a few things I'd definitely consider fixing. The first one is the phosphorus seen, as well as our potassium. They're probably the two really big limiting factors here. Sulfur, to some extent, it would be pretty easy to overcome that with some gypsum. And then our trace minerals, which I'd probably more consider foliar sprays for them, apart from maybe molybdenum and cobalt, which I'd do an application onto the soil surface for the biology in the soil, as well as foliar sprays. And depending on the enterprise, we'll be looking at, say, applying soft rock phosphate for the phosphorus, and we can add some gypsum to that as well for the sulfur, and get some calcium in there too. Really, you can never have enough calcium. Calcium's great. You just keep adding it, which will also assist with the pH. Potassium can be pretty expensive, so potentially looking for a source of potassium, doing a little bit up front, or potentially with a starter fertilizer, and then applying the rest as foliar spray. And sometimes you can actually get it to the point where I only need to apply some in the a foliar spray during grain fill to really have high yields. And then I'd be looking at foliar applying a lot of these trace minerals. And so with that, we actually have a nutritional recommendation that comes with all of our reports. It's for free, which is pretty great value. So if you want a second opinion from your own agronomist, or you're simply by yourself and you need help with this, there's free nutritional recommendations that you can use as a guideline. There are limitations in this model, but they're pretty good, and a lot of agros basically have these models going anyways, and that's how they generate your own report. So what I've done is I've just done this for free for you, and there's a few important things to note. So we have our minerals coming down the side here, and so there's a few things to note on our nutritional recommendations. So the first one's mineral. That's pretty obvious. Our application of that mineral in a kilos per hectare. So it's not the product, but it's a mineral. So then you've got to convert this into the product application per hectare. We also have a component here called available from totals. So this might actually not be this would suggest you don't have to apply so much a nutritional application, but a biological application to convert those totals into available. So sulfur really and boron, I think, are the only ones, which we kind of talked about before. Might not be a biological problem, but more of a leaching problem. Finally, we have an estimated price you can get. Now, these are estimated based on a whole range of different factors. The actual price you're going to get is going to depend on your area, what source you're going to use. These are just a rough guess. Eventually, we'll have info for each of our minerals that you can click on to go to a website. You can see videos from me talking about these different minerals, the best form to apply them, whatnot. So we'll have regenerative nutrition guides for each mineral in the future. This is a estimated cost of applying all these minerals and properly, more or less, balancing your soil to make sure you overcome any limitations in your soil. Now, it's not quite a soil balancing recommendation. As you could see before, the magnesium, which was in short supply in terms of the base saturation and in terms of its percentage on the clay colloid, we're not making an application for that. It's simply to make sure all those minerals are there for the plant. Finally, it's important to note that we believe in actually reducing our inputs, or on the other side, maximizing our mineral or nutrient use efficiency. So we believe that some of these are actually not best applied to the soil as fertilizer, but potentially using other ways of producing your own nutrition. So we've included an estimate on how much you can reduce your inputs by, and a new total if you were more or less to carry out a nutritional program like this. With this is wouldn't be so much of a like every year application. It would be, okay, let's spread this across 5 years, make small applications across that whole time, and over time build our soil like that. And then finally, if you get to the end here and you need some more assistance, there's you can book a free consultation. It's 30-minute consultation. We'll go over this report, highlight all the things you need to know. We can recommend some products that we have access to and all that good stuff. And that's it. So I hope that gives you some inspiration and insight as to how to read a soil test and what the different components mean. There are different soil tests out there, and we have another video coming out about Haney soil tests, which are really good, and we recommend them quite a bit. But again, if you need any help with your soil tests, let me know. We can come do the testing for you. If you're in anywhere in Australia, there is a travel fee, but we can come out. Otherwise, we can help you read your own soil tests if you collect them or you have an agronomist collect them for you. Awesome. Thanks again for watching. My name's Teal Simmons from Agresol. Cheers.